Yeah, just wanted to say welcome wherever you are and however you are. Cool thing about this practice is you don't have to be any particular way because we're just going to be noticing how it is. So if you're present, that's great. If you're tired and hungry, that's equally great. I wanted to share a little bit of my background with respect to social meditation and how I got into it because I feel like it's a good description of kind of the limitations of traditional silent introspective meditation. And it also, for me at least, it's a personal way of sharing what I find most kind of interesting and passionate. I'm most passionate about with respect to this stuff. So I will share a little bit. I got into meditation as a teenager, as some do, and I went off the deep end pretty much. As a freshman in college, I more or less dropped out of. I dropped out of school. I failed. I started flunking my philosophy classes, and just yeah. Okay, another one. Great. Welcome. Anyone who's flunked philosophy, welcome. And I started meditating full time at that point, and found myself in a really cool community of weird contemplatives and a very eclectic bunch called the Self Knowledge Symposium. I was in school at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we were really lucky. We had this really weird student group where a bunch of weirdos got together that were obsessed with enlightenment. So I caught the enlightenment bug pretty hard. And as I said, I dropped out of school essentially to meditate full time and wait tables. And and then my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, and I've been really, it's amazing that she's still with me given how much I put her through with this whole searching quest. She one day brought this magazine to me. It was called the Utni Reader. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it was yeah, okay, kind of a cool hippie magazine with lots of cool spiritual stuff. And she brought it to me, and the back cover was this advertisement for Naropa University out in Colorado. And she said, "Hey, look, you could meditate full time and get your degree." And I said, "Okay, that's a good idea." And she's really smart. She, knew she didn't want to be married to a dropout meditator for forever. And so I did. We moved to Colorado, and I I continued full time meditation there. And during the course of my 20s, along with my partner Emily, I spent in total a year on silent retreat. Not all at once. I spent them in chunks, doing 7 days, 9 days, 1 month, 6 weeks, 2 months. They started getting longer and longer, but essentially, silent retreat practice and a personal home practice of a couple hours a day became kind of the core of my meditative practice. Most of it was done in the insight meditation or Vipassana tradition. I studied closely with Jack Kornfield and Trudy Goodman, who several years ago empowered me to teach in their lineage. And I also studied with a couple rogue teachers named Daniel Ingram and Kenneth Folk, who also encouraged me to teach at a certain point when I felt I was ready. And so my spiritual home is very much in this tradition of insight meditation or Vipassana, or the sometimes called the Theravada school of early Buddhism. At the same time, I explored a lot of other traditions. While I was at Naropa, we studied all kinds of stuff. Chogyam Trungpa founded it, so I studied Vajrayana Buddhism, got into Zen, and really found I loved the Zen tradition. Very different from Vipassana in a lot of ways, but very complementary as well. Curious if anyone here has studied in either of those traditions, Vipassana or Zen. Yeah, okay, cool. A little bit, yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. It's good to know. And so basically, my 20s, I spent, searching for enlightenment, having some experiences of enlightenment, having to let go of those experiences, and then going deeper. That hasn't really stopped. But what did shift for me is that one day, one of my closest teachers, who I mentioned before, Kenneth Folk, he told me over Skype that he had, this was in 2010, he said, I found a brilliant way to teach this Vipassana technique, this insight meditation technique it's called noting meditation. And he said, I've found a way better way to teach it. And you, instead of doing it silently, instead of telling people how to do the practice and then have them go off, do it by themselves for a while, maybe come back and report on how it went. Of course, at that point, as a teacher, you're getting secondhand information because people are adding all kinds of interpretive frameworks and stories on top of their actual subjective experience. And then giving them feedback and saying, okay, now go try this and adjust your practice. He said, I found out that if you just do it out loud and take turns, it's way better because I can hear how people are practicing. I can model the practice. I can show them how to do it in real time. And, you know, he's been doing it for 10,000, 20,000 hours. So you get to actually hear someone who's masterful at the technique do it. And he said, and then I can instantly give them feedback. So they don't have to go off and like do practice wrong for a month before they can hear like that they're doing it wrong. And so that was revolutionary for him as a teacher pedagogically. But what it also did is it opened the practice up into the intersubjective domain. It made it an interpersonal practice. No longer are you just noticing your own experience, sitting by yourself in a room, quiet, hopefully. But then you're doing that actually with other people and doing it out loud. And I know this is probably not new to most of you because interpersonal practices have become, I'd say, quite hot in the last decade or so. And there are lots of different kinds. But what I teach are forms of practice that are intentionally translated from longstanding practices within these Buddhist traditions. You know, as a Dharma teacher and lineage holder, I see my role as being as a translator. You know, my teachers went to Asia, most of them, they were Westerners who went to Asia in the 60s and 70s, and they hung out with Asian teachers and monks, and they received that as well, and they had to translate from East to West. Now, I feel like our generation, my generation, if you're a millennial, you'll know this, we have to translate from the analog to the digital. You have to figure out how to translate across that gap, which is quite vast. And for me, part of that is looking at the way that the digital environment, the age of the network, alters our sense of self. You know, where the sense of self in pre-internet seemed to be really rooted in a sense of individualism, you know, in a kind of separate, isolated, austere, perhaps, self, a sense of self that's not controlled by the environment. If you're really individuated, that's the idea. You're not subject to everyone else's whims and beliefs. But there's a challenge with that, an issue with that, because it doesn't acknowledge and honor the deeply interpersonal nature of self, the way that we make each other up. And I think the internet, for digital natives, for sure, for those of us who spent time on the internet, you just kind of get naturally, right, that the self is co-constructed with other selves. You know, is the nature of the self. And this was some profound realization like 1,500 years ago or 2,000 years ago, whatever. And now it's just like, oh yeah, that's like Wednesday. You know, I get online and and immediately I'm myself is arising in this vast interpersonal field of interactions. And meditation needs to catch up with that. Essentially, that's what I'm getting at. And I found that it was really important for me to break out of my introspective mode as a practitioner and as a budding teacher and start to realize there's other ways to do this. And there's other things one can notice if one brings the power of attention to relationship. So that's kind of the gist of the social meditation practice. To me, it's about collective awakening. It's about bringing attention to the intersubjective nature of co-arising experience. It's about training in being aware of oneself and others simultaneously, of not collapsing into self-absorption or of losing oneself and others, but being able to hold presence with ourselves and others. There are a lot of different social meditation techniques. One of the first I learned from Kenneth Folk, who I mentioned, who was developing this practice originally. was called There Is Noting. And in There Is Noting, you just say there is, as we did in the check-in, and then you use a word or two to describe your experience. So if I could do that for a moment just to demonstrate, there is seeing, there is pressure, there's breathing, there is fear, there is curiosity, there's relaxing, there's swaying, there's dropping, and so on. So all I'm doing there is just paying attention to the flow of experience. I'm just saying there is, and then I'm just noticing what there is in my sensory experience. So that's a form of mindfulness or vipassana or insight meditation. It's a way of practicing where you're paying attention moment to what's happening. And I had done that for thousands of hours, but I'd done it all internally, mentally, by myself. So once I realized you could do it out loud with others, I was hooked. I was like, oh, this is great. And so I did. I started doing that in 2010, started teaching it to others, and I've continued to develop on the work that Kenneth's done and craft new forms of social meditation. Another, and actually this was the first form of social practice that I encountered much earlier, 2004. I'd moved to Boulder, Colorado, and I was working for a philosopher named Ken Wilber at his Integral Institute. And he was friends with a couple of Zen teachers named Genpo Merzel Roshi, and Diane Musho Hamilton. And they taught this really interesting out loud form of practice called Big Mind. And in Big Mind practice, one actually is invited to become one with some aspect of experience. It could be some aspect of your sort of small self-experience. Like, as the controller, I notice that there is wanting to control this moment and make sure everyone is happy. Or as the wounded child, there is tenderness and weepiness. And you could describe what it's like. You actually become one with something, and then you start to speak as that. And that was a really powerful technique. In fact, it gave me some of my first earliest glimpses of some of the transpersonal enlightened states of consciousness. And it's really powerful for doing that. It's actually powerful for giving people a glimpse. And it's amazing because you do that by simply asking yourself to become, say, enlightened mind or big mind or compassion. And you just say, okay, I'm just going to do that. I'm going to just be compassion. And you just sort of take the role of compassion. You let yourself become compassion and then see what you notice. And it's kind of shocking, actually, that most people, like 99% of the people that did the practice or so, actually said they could do it. They felt it. And I think part of the reason is because they could actually hear everyone else feeling it. So it creates this sort of collective groove where suddenly people are accessing compassion and becoming compassion. It's like, oh. And so that was the first technique I was exposed to. Then I did this vipassana, this out loud vipassana or social noting. And one day it occurred to me, well, why couldn't those two be brought together? What would it be like to bring those two practices together? In the Zen tradition, it's often the case that we're becoming one with whatever is, of no separation, non-duality, no inside or outside, just this, whatever this is. And that's powerful. And it's very different than mindfulness practice, where you're kind of cultivating the sense of an observer, a witness who can kind of watch the flow of experience. When I did that, there is noting, right? You hear experience and it's changing. And who is it that's noticing all that? There's seeing, there's thinking, there's relaxing. It's kind of a sense of a witness, of awareness. One of my teachers, Ajahn Chah, called it the one who knows. He said, you could just rest as the one who knows. And I think that's also a really beautiful practice. But they're very different. As one teacher who trained in both lineages, Shinzen Young, an American mindfulness and Zen teacher, said, Zen is a powerful poem. Vipassana, on the other hand, should be a carefully crafted essay. And this kind of describes a little bit of the difference between these two in general terms, really general, broad terms. There's a lot of differences within these traditions, of course, and I don't want to discard that, but I'm zooming out as a way to set up the practice. So in this practice of Zen noting, what we're going to do is kind of bring these two together, the big mind practice of becoming one with something, and then the Vipassana or mindfulness practice of noticing what it's like. So in Zen noting, we become one with what we want to notice as. We become one with what we want to notice as. And what I'd like to invite us to do is to become one with wisdom first, and then to become one with compassion. And then to see what it's like as wisdom, what you notice, what is there as wisdom, what do you notice in your experience together? And then what is there as compassion? And the reason I bring these two up is because these two ideas are really central in the Buddhist tradition, especially in an aspect of it called the Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle, which was developed after the historical Buddha. It was kind of a iteration on the Buddhist teachings and evolution. And in that tradition, it's often said, the wings of the bird of awakening, the thing that actually brings us to awakening, one side of this bird is wisdom, the other is compassion. You have to have both. Just wisdom without any heartfulness, any warmth, any care, it's like you get the self-enlightened asshole, which I will admit to having been and still being on occasion. And on the other side, if you get just compassion, just caring, just always wanting to help, you get this sort of, as one teacher I really appreciate, Chogyam Trungpa, said, you get idiot compassion. You get the sense of constantly sacrificing yourself for others and not really ever realizing there's some place in us where we can abide that is actually okay, even if we're suffering and others are suffering. It actually could be okay, even if the world is going into smoke. And that's a really powerful contemplation today. We don't know what's going to happen, but there's some part of us that can be okay, that wisdom in us that knows this is just what's happening right now. So bringing them together is really powerful. So that's what I'm hoping to explore, both wisdom and compassion together. And the way that this would look is that we will go into small groups of 3 to 4 people each. And we're just basically going to take turns doing the basic exercise. And this is what it looks like. As wisdom. And here there's a leap of faith. You just kind of trust that something's going to come out. And it doesn't really matter what it is, because whatever it is, you can just note it. As wisdom, there is relaxing. I'll do this for a little bit just so you can hear. As wisdom, there's trusting. As wisdom, there's not knowing. As wisdom, there's releasing and dissolving. And so forth. And the idea here is just kind of taking this leap as wisdom and just trusting you can be it, or something will happen. And then just say there is, and just whatever you notice as wisdom, whatever is there. You don't have to fabricate anything. Wisdom doesn't do that anyway. So just notice what you notice. And you can use a word or two to describe that, keeping it simple. We're not trying to go into a long essay on our experience, although I did just say Vipassana is like a carefully crafted essay. But rather, we're just trying to get to the heart, the pith, the essence of what it is we're noticing. That's the mindfulness practice. There's also an option in social meditation to be a witness, to be a silent observer. You don't have to participate out loud to get the benefit of the practice, actually. You can sit and listen and just take it in and hear other people's journey and be with them in that. So before we start the practice, I'm going to ask to see if there are any people who would like to witness, to be a silent observer. And we'll make sure and pair you with some other folks that are doing it out loud, and that's a completely valid way to participate. Peter, I was going to ask, could I get some breakout room capability? That way I can work my magic. Is that
Cool.
possible?
Yeah, I was just doing it. I can hand it to you, or
Okay.
yeah.
I prefer doing it because there's a number of intricacies I've noticed with this that are
Okay.
helpful. But thank you. Should ask you about that earlier.
Do you want me to
So,
up the recording here?
totally up to you.
Okay.